How's everybody doing? So this is a bit of a long video. 50 greatest historical events that never happened. So I'll break this down into 3 19-minute videos, and we'll go from there. I'll try to stop it not in the middle of one of the numbers, but in between, kind of span them out. So there's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate. You don't have to. You can subscribe if this is the kind of stuff that you like. Let me know in the comments, and give me a thumbs up if all else fails. Ready? Let's go.
Stories. However, many of the most entertaining anecdotes may...
Sorry, I didn't realize. Here you go. Let's go back. Okay.
There have been thousands of years of recorded history full of incredible stories. However, many of the most entertaining anecdotes may never have happened at all. Often, these stories first began circulating as fact well after the people involved were dead, meant as a way to emphasize a particular character trait of that individual. Others used entirely fictional people to illustrate a particular point that the speaker wanted to get across. Today we'll be diving into 50 apocryphal tales, looking at some of the most famous and memorable stories from throughout history that may or may not have actually transpired. George Washington the Cherry Tree. When George Washington was 6 years old, he was given a hatchet as a present by his father. As he was still a young child, Washington went out to play with his new toy, chopping at various things. While running around, Washington came across a cherry tree and struck it multiple times with his hatchet. He did not fully cut down the tree, but he damaged it enough that it wound up dying as a result. After seeing that his favorite cherry tree had been killed, Washington's father angrily confronted him, demanding to know what had happened to the tree. Washington replied, "I cannot tell a lie, father. You know I cannot tell a lie. I cut it with my little hatchet." Rather than being punished, the young George Washington was praised for his honesty. It's a great story about the bravery and integrity of the first American president, and it almost certainly never happened. The story was invented by Mason Locke Weems, a traveling bookseller and the author of the first biography written about Washington. The former president had died in 1799, and Weems published his book the following year in 1800. It was an instant success, but the story wasn't even originally included. Weems didn't add the apocryphal tale until the 5th edition of the book in 1806, meaning it was almost certainly just a piece of fiction. Today's episode is brought to you by the Paper-like 2.1 screen potential, which absolutely allows you to unlock your iPad's full potential. Have you ever been using an iPad? It's too shiny.
Really? So, cherry trees back in those days, that was a form of not produce. That was agriculture. So you chop down a cherry tree, that person could come after you financially, because it's like setting their tobacco crop on fire, or whatever it is that they needed for a livelihood. You just took away money, and that was not good. We're going to fast forward a little bit. See if I can.
It doesn't really feel like paper. Well, paper-like makes it feel like paper, and then you can draw on it. And I thought when they first approached me about sponsoring, I was like,
thanks, paper
product.
Thing.
Anyway, thanks to Paper-like for today's sponsorship, and now back to today's video. George Washington and the silver dollar. Next, let's have a look at another story about Washington that may have more of a basis in reality. He was an active and athletic man, and it's often reported that he took part in the common pastime of distance throwing. This has led to superhuman descriptions of his strength, including a feat in which Washington threw a silver dollar clear across the Potomac River, or possibly the Delaware River. These stories are impossible exaggerations, as the silver dollar didn't exist until Washington was in his 60s, and the Potomac is over a mile wide. However, the original story came from his step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. According to the grandson, it was a piece of slate roughly the size of a silver dollar that Washington had thrown, and that it was a narrow part of the Rappahannock River near Washington's childhood home. With some parts of the river narrowing to about 250 feet, this was much more plausible, though still very impressive. In 1936, the legend was put to the test by Baseball Hall of Famer Walter Big Train Johnson to celebrate Washington's 204th birthday. Johnson was taken to a part of the river estimated to be 380 feet across and given 3 attempts. The first fell just short of the opposite bank, and the second barely crossed the river. Not wanting to disappoint, Johnson threw the third coin clear over the heads of some 2,000 spectators on the opposite side of the river. The historic memento was then retrieved by Peter Yon. When questioned by reporters what he intended to do with the coin, Yon replied, "I cannot tell a lie. I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder." Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Nero is known for being a cruel emperor, and there is the off-cited anecdote that he fiddled while Rome burned. It is true that Nero cared more about his own musical and artistic endeavors than he did about the welfare of the Roman people, though if there was any truth to this story, Nero would have been playing the lyre rather than the fiddle. The story is often attributed to Roman historian Tacitus, though he never actually made this claim. According to Tacitus and many other sources, Nero was 35 miles away when the Great Fire of Rome broke out, and he quickly returned to help coordinate the relief efforts. However, Tacitus did insinuate that Nero may have orchestrated the fire and that he used it for his own benefit by building his grand palace in the area that the fire had devastated. It's unclear what the origin of this apocryphal tale was, but the intent was clear: to portray Nero as a heartless and indifferent leader, more interested in himself than in the subjects he was supposed to be ruling over. It's certainly not an unfair characterization of the Roman emperor, even if this story didn't happen. Zeno's paradoxes of motion. The Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea is famous for his motion paradoxes. The argument states that which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at its goal. That certainly makes sense and seems to be obviously true, but Zeno used this paradox to argue that all motion was impossible. Let's say you want to run a mile. Before you can finish the mile, you must run half a mile, but before you can finish the second half mile, you must run a quarter of a mile, then an eighth, a 16th, and so on. The remaining distance can be divided in half an infinite number of times, so the runner must complete an infinite number of tasks before arriving at the destination. Because a person cannot complete infinite tasks in a finite amount of time, Zeno argued that it was impossible to ever reach a destination. Using the same arguments on the front end of the journey, he also argued that it was impossible for a person to start moving as well, and thus all motion was an illusion. In his writings, the Greek philosopher Simplicus wrote that upon hearing Zeno's argument, the aptly named Diogenes the Cynic stood up and walked around disproving the idea that motion was impossible. Of course, this story almost certainly never happened. Zeno was only about 11 years old when Diogenes died, and Simplicus was writing about it several centuries later. But true or not, it was a fantastic mic drop moment for Diogenes. Behold a man. Diogenes' alleged antics didn't end with Zeno. This entire episode could probably be filled with apocryphal stories of Greece's most hilariously antagonistic philosopher, but we'll stick with just one more for now. What it means to be human was of great interest to the ancient Greeks, and interest in that question never really went away. This was not only the subject of many philosophical debates, but of scientific debates as well. Plato sought to create a scientific definition of what a man was, and settled on declaring that humans were defined as featherless bipeds. It's not a terrible definition, as only humans and birds are bipedal, so this combination was rather uniquely human. Upon hearing this definition, Diogenes went home and plucked all the feathers off of a chicken. He then attended Plato's next lecture, and when Plato repeated his definition, Diogenes held up the bald chicken, declaring, "Behold, a man." Plato amended his definition to include with broad, flat nails, seemingly missing the entire point of Diogenes' criticism. As popular as this story is, it doesn't appear in any ancient Greek texts. We can just hope that Diogenes was really as entertaining as all the apocryphal stories make him out to be. Detachable shirt collars. In the late 1700s, high collars for men were all the rage. The higher and stiffer the collar a man had, the more wealthy and important he must be. While many people today would consider this somewhat ridiculous trend to be a fashion crime, it wasn't actually a victimless crime. Those collars needed to be washed and starched each time they were worn, and this task became one of the many jobs of irritated wives. One man's wife allegedly became so annoyed with the whole situation that she decided to do something about it. After a week of work, the husband would have 5 shirts that were perfectly clean except for the collars, and she would have to spend time washing and starching them all. Fed up with washing clean shirts, she cut the collars off of her husband's shirts, washing and starching them separately as a way to save time. This is the claimed origin of detachable shirt collars, which became an entire industry starting in the 1820s. No name is ever given for this woman, so the entire story was likely invented as a marketing tactic to get women to encourage their husbands to buy these collars. Judgment of Solomon. The Judgment of Solomon is one of the most famous ancient stories, constantly being referenced and parodied throughout pop culture. In the story, two women who lived in the same house went before Solomon along with an infant child. Both women had given birth at around the same time, but one of the children had died in its sleep. They each claimed that the surviving baby was theirs and asked Solomon to rule on the matter. Solomon called for his sword and declared that the child would be cut in half, with each woman receiving half a baby. One woman agreed to this judgment, saying that if she couldn't have the baby, then no one could have it. The other begged Solomon to spare the child's life and just give it to the other mother. Solomon declared that the latter woman was the true mother, as a mother would do anything to save the life of her child, even if it meant giving it up. The story first appeared in the Book of Kings. As we previously discussed on this channel, much of that particular book of the Bible is a reasonably accurate chronicle of Jewish history. However, while there is a small amount of archaeological evidence suggesting King Solomon did exist, the biblical stories of his reign are regarded as being far more embellished than most of the Book of Kings. This story likely never happened and was just a popular anecdote to demonstrate Solomon's wisdom. Albert Einstein failed maths.
I was going to say, I don't think it would have ever existed only because the threat of cutting a baby in half. The threat of cutting a baby in half. What if both of them were like, yeah, that's fair? So, clearly no.
For generations, Einstein's early academic career has been a source of inspiration for those struggling in school as well as for the gifted but lazy underachievers. After all, everyone knows that Einstein failed maths as a child. Some versions of the story say it was because he had trouble understanding the material, and others say it was because he found it boring and just didn't care. But is there any truth to this famous story? No, not at all. It's Albert Einstein. Do you really think that he failed mathematics? It's unclear exactly where this myth originated, but it was ubiquitous well before he died. In 1935, a rabbi at Princeton showed Einstein a newspaper article making this claim. He reportedly laughed and said, "Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." The only kernel of truth of this story is that Einstein was a somewhat lazy student. He had very poor attendance during college, instead choosing to copy notes off one of his friends in the physics program. But despite this, he was still at the top of his class. The only poor grade Einstein seems to have received in any class was from one university professor who took a personal offense to how often he skipped class, despite him excelling on the exams. Et tu, Brute. On March the
I want to share, I don't know if I've told this story. So I heard this about Einstein. Einstein used to go and give speeches and to college. And I think it was in the U.S. And he was asked a question, who's the smartest person that you've ever met? And he said, or that you've ever known. And he said, my chauffeur, my driver. And they said, really? Why? And he said, he's mastered everything that he's in all my lectures. Everything that I've ever done. He's actually mastered the whole thing. And they were like, really? Why do you say that? And he goes, let me tell you a story. If you've heard the story, it's funny. He was giving all these speeches and he came up sick. And he didn't want to give this speech and he wanted to call out. And the driver said, I'll tell you what. They don't know what you look like. I'll give the speech for you. You just come in and sit there. And Einstein was like, okay. And he might have made a bet with the person. Like, I don't think you're going to be able to give this speech. And the driver was like, I got it. He's in there. He takes it's just tons of text. He's in there, the driver, giving this speech. And somebody starts asking questions, and he's answering them. And then somebody asks a good question. And the driver stands there for a second, looks at the lady, and kind of chuckles. And he goes, that's the easiest question in the world. Like, it's almost insulting for me to answer it. In fact, to show you how easy that question is, I'm gonna let my driver, who was Albert Einstein, but no one had known, he goes, I'm going to let my driver answer that. So Albert Einstein perks up and answers the question. And then sits back down, and the guy looks over and goes, "Even my driver knew that." And no one was the wiser until Albert Einstein years later basically admitted, "Yeah, I got paid to give one speech, and I think he gave that money to the driver." It's a hilarious story.
15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was surrounded and assassinated by around 40 Roman senators. After taking stock of his various attackers, he spoke his final words to one who was very close to him. Et tu, Brute. The story of Julius Caesar is inseparable from these famous last words, but Caesar never said this. The quote first appeared in William Shakespeare's play about Caesar. That's not to say that it isn't somewhat based in reality, but there is debate among historians about Caesar's last words. When the attack began, Caesar said in Latin, "Ista quidem vis est," or "but this is violence." There are two common theories, both of which date back to at least the 2nd century AD. Some accounts claim those were his last words, and that he said nothing further once the stabbing began. Others claimed that he then spoke the words, "You too, child," somewhat similar to the famous "Et tu, Brute." However, if Caesar really did say those words, it's reported that he said them in Greek rather than in Latin. If he did say that, it's also unclear whether the comment was even directed at Marcus Brutus, or if it was meant to be for Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who he referred to as being like a son to him, and who many believed was in fact his illegitimate child. Benjamin Franklin's kite. In June 1752, Benjamin Franklin tied a key to a string and flew it during a thunderstorm. The key was struck by lightning, and thus Franklin discovered electricity. That's how the story was originally told, though more recently it's become common knowledge that people already understood the existence of electricity and that Franklin was merely trying to prove lightning was made up of electricity. Although the story is considered apocryphal, with many historians doubting its authenticity, the origin of this story is a letter written by Franklin himself. However, in the letter, Franklin merely described the experiment. He never stated when or even if he had actually conducted it. 15 years later, Joseph Priestley's book History and Present Status of Electricity recounted the tale, presumably with additional details provided to him by Franklin. While Priestley claims that Franklin and his son did conduct the experiment, there was no claim that the key was struck by lightning. If it had been, Franklin almost certainly would have died. We know this because others died while conducting lightning rod experiments described by Franklin. According to the book, the kite was drawn back down to the ground after flying in the storm, and Franklin felt an electrical charge on the key when he touched it. It had picked up ambient electrical charge in the air. Benjamin Franklin's national bird. It's tradition to eat turkey on Thanksgiving in the United States, but according to a popular story, this wouldn't be the case if Benjamin Franklin had his way. This story started to circulate in newspapers when the United States was celebrating its 100th birthday, and it was based on a letter that Franklin wrote to his daughter. In the letter, Franklin criticized the bald eagle, calling it lazy and of bad moral character. He went on to say that the turkey was a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America. But while Franklin may have preferred the turkey to the eagle, he never nominated it to be the national bird, nor did he make any of these comments publicly. The context of the letter was to criticize the original design for the Great Seal of the United States, as he felt the design of the eagle made it look more like a turkey. This was what led to his tangent on avian morality. However, Franklin didn't want the turkey on the Great Seal either. He had been given the chance to design the seal several years earlier, and his proposed design featured neither an eagle nor a turkey, but rather Moses parting the Red Sea. What that had to do with the United States is anybody's guess, which is probably why it was rejected. The Gordian Knot. When Alexander the Great set out on his conquest of Asia Minor, he had a legendary encounter with the Gordian Knot. In Gordium in Phrygia, there was an extremely intricate knot connecting an ox cart to a post. The knot had been tied by King Gordius, a peasant who was declared king and became the foster father to the eventual King Midas. An oracle declared that any man who could untangle the elaborate knot would become ruler of all of Asia. When Alexander heard this story, naturally he wanted to untie the knot. According to the legend, he tried to untie the knot conventionally, but to no avail. He then reasoned that it didn't matter how the knot became undone, just that it did, so he pulled his sword out and cut the knot in half. Now, this is a fun story, demonstrating how seemingly complex problems can be easily solved with brute force, although that's not necessarily a great lesson, is it? But did it happen? Well, allegedly it sort of did. According to Greek historian Aristobulus, who accompanied Alexander on his campaign, they really did encounter the Gordian knot. However, Aristobulus described a more clever solution devised by Alexander. Rather than cutting the knot in half, he stated that Alexander removed the linchpin from the yoke of the ox cart, freeing one end of the rope so that it could be easily untied. While this story is considered more plausible, it may still have been a piece of fiction designed by Aristobulus to legitimize Alexander's expansion foundation of the Greek Empire. Columbus proved the Earth was round. In 1492, Columbus dared to do the unthinkable and sail west to his inevitable doom. Everyone knew the Earth was flat, but Columbus was a brave and daring explorer who sought to prove them all wrong. But before they could even leave port, Columbus had to convince the ignorant and superstitious sailors that the Earth really was round. And of course, we all know this isn't true, and it's been well established since ancient times that the Earth is round. However, the origin of this myth is surprisingly interesting. It's often attributed to the 1828 biography of Columbus by Washington Irving, titled A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. Irving was a fiction writer, and this supposed biography was a heavily fictionalized and unrealistic retelling of history. But
Washington Irving made the Headless Horseman. He wrote that book. Wrote a book on Washington as well. George Washington. It's very difficult to read. He wrote it. He met Washington. I think he was 3 or 4, maybe 5. And he wrote his life story. I don't remember how many parts it was. It's a very difficult read. Good, very difficult.
while this book perpetuated the myth that people in the Middle Ages believed that the Earth was flat, it was part of a much larger trend. This began in the 1600s as a coordinated effort by Protestants to disparage Catholic teaching. In the 1800s, the myth became extremely widespread, thanks to both revisionist histories, like Irving's book, as well as an increasing belief that science and religion had been extremely antagonistic in the Middle Ages. The latter belief completely ignored the fact that many scientists were also members of the clergy. Columbus's ships. While we're on the topic of Columbus, children across the United States have learned for centuries that he sailed to America on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. However, those were not actually the names of the three ships. Ships at the time were almost invariably named after saints, so while the Santa Maria is correct, the other two names were not. Sailors would normally give nicknames to boats, which is what the names Nina and Pinta would have been. Pinta was Spanish for painted one, and Nina was Spanish for little girl. We know that the Nina's real name was the Santa Clara, but the actual name of the Pinta is unknown. Catherine the Great's death. Catherine the Great was Russia's longest reigning empress and accomplished a great deal during her time on the throne. However, one of the things she was most known for was the many lovers she took as empress. Catherine would invite a man to be with her until she got bored of him, at which point she would give him some land, serfs, and a pension and send him on his way. This led to a lot of rumors and urban legends, the most famous of which was about Catherine's cause of death. According to the tale, Catherine was engaging in amorous activities with her favorite horse. The harness that was suspending the horse broke, and the horse crushed Catherine to death. Although this apocryphal tale began circulating immediately after her death and persisted for centuries, it was nothing but slander. Catherine actually died from a stroke, and the story about her horse was one of many salacious rumors started by her political enemies to discredit the empress. The Salting of Carthage. The Third Punic Wars took place between Rome and Carthage from 149 BC through 146 BC. Although the siege of Carthage took 3 full years, the Romans were eventually successful in their mission. But it wasn't enough to win. They had to send a message. To that end, the Roman general Scipio Alamanus razed all the buildings in the city and sowed the ground with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Or so the story goes, and it was a pretty believable one. There are many ancient references to salting the earth, and the salting of Carthage is among the most famous, second only to the biblical account of the salting of Shechem. However, while ancient sources do mention this practice, it is unclear how often it actually happens. When it did, it was likely a small symbolic gesture, possibly meant to place a curse on the conquered lands. Actually salting the ground to prevent agriculture, which would have required massive amounts of salt, would have been prohibitively expensive and a logistical nightmare. However, it's unlikely that this happened to Carthage even in a symbolic fashion. While Scipio did raise Carthage and the Romans were intent on the city remaining in ruins, there are no ancient references to the salting of Carthage. The first book about the Third Punic War to include this detail wasn't written until the 19th century. Because the practice was believed to be common in ancient times, it's believed that the author added the detail simply to make the story more interesting in a plausible way. Historians of the past, everybody. Stockbrokers.
All right, we're going to pause it there. Yeah, it'll be about 57 minutes at the 19-minute mark. So it's a little over, but it's okay. All right, we're going to end it there, and we will be back with part 2 and then part 3. Part 3 will just be the finish up. That's interesting so far. Yeah, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. Huh. Interesting. Well, anyways, I hope you found this good, and I hope you'll tune back in for part 2 and part 3. But until next time, have a good day, have a good night.